2024 was definitely a year that happened. Between bringing the boom, watching the Olympics, and living through yet another presidential election, it was only a matter of time before we ran to our Saturday mornings begging for Reese Davis to tell us that we were looking live from beautiful college campuses all across the country. College football finally kicked off its 2024-2025 season on August 24th, and man, was America pumped. The 2023 season ended with many more questions than answers, leading to the high anticipation going into the following year. How will Florida State respond to being left out of the playoffs? Will the first 12-team playoff be beneficial for the sport? Will Alabama still be a dominant force without Nick Saban? Is Texas finally back? These were the questions that plagued message boards for several months leading up to the first kickoff, and I am happy to say that 2024... yeah, it was alright. Before I talk about my opinions on this past season, I want to preface you guys with the fact that I will be splitting this video into 3 different sections, those sections being the good, the bad, and the ugly. To start things off on a positive note, we're going to talk about the good stuff first, and there's no better place to start that topic off than in week 0. I am all for expanding college football to new audiences, and having the first game of the season being in Dublin, Ireland was freaking awesome. While not the first time it's happened, it's always cool to see American football teams playing the sport overseas. After seeing Notre Dame blow out Navy in Dublin the year prior, I was excited to see a more evenly matched game between 2 Power 5 programs, those being Florida State and Georgia Tech. The defending ACC champions went into this game with a chip on their shoulder after not being given a playoff spot in the year prior. How did they respond to this? Yeah, we'll talk about that more later in the video, but seeing Ireland not only get a better matchup, but also an upset was really good for the sport, and I'm so happy they got to witness that. Next on the list of good things is College Game Day. College Game Day is one of the things in college football that is consistently good most years, but I think what made this year stand out the most was the addition of former Alabama head coach Nick Saban. Saban's retirement from coaching back in January definitely felt like a meteor crashed into the center of Tuscaloosa. While my fellow Alabamians were grieving like somebody in the family just died, the rest of the college football world celebrated as the reign of terror was officially over. Following his retirement, Saban was moved over to the cast of ESPN's College Game Day, where he could share some ball wisdom while also dropping the occasional one-liner or two.
Yeah, well, I think they're both bullshitting us, but...
He said a swear word. That's my coach.
Fans everywhere ate this stuff up, loving the guy more than ever now that he was on the neutral side of things. His relationship with Pat McAfee was one of the many running gags of the season, and with their interactions between the two becoming some of the funniest moments of the season. Up next is upsets galore. Sports fans love nothing more than a good old-fashioned upset. Unless your team is the one being upset, that's not really fun. For the sake of the sport, however, there were a lot of huge upsets that definitely helped build up the hype going into the playoffs. Week 2 saw NIU winning one of the biggest games in its program's history over Notre Dame. Kentucky helped shut down Ole Miss's playoff hopes in a big Week 5 road game. Vanderbilt defended its home against Alabama just a week after the Tide became the new #1 team in the country, and so many more. Alabama actually got upset on 2 more occasions against Oklahoma and Michigan. Georgia got upset in the playoffs after being dismantled by Notre Dame, and who could forget the Wolverines keeping the streak alive against Ohio State just before the Big Ten championship. In addition to these games, there were a lot of close calls this season as well, with Vanderbilt just barely losing games to number 7 Missouri, number 5 Texas, and number 8 Tennessee. Georgia Tech went into 8 overtimes against the rival Georgia Bulldogs, just barely failing to win that game. Arizona State even went into overtime against the 3-seed Texas in the college football playoffs. The quality of play this season was simply insane, and it'll be really hard to follow up what we saw for the 2025 season. For every big piece of news that was there to excite us during the offseason, there was always the reminder that California and Stanford were moving to the Atlantic Coast Conference. Yep, I'm talking about conference realignment, aka the literal devil. Now, we knew about a lot of these realignment plans years in advance, but seeing them all just kind of happen at once was very jarring at first. For starters, the Pac-12 was completely drained of all of its substance, leaving only 2 teams to hold down the fort for a year. Oregon, UCLA, USC, and Washington all moved to the Big Ten Conference. Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah moved over to the Big 12 Conference. And California, alongside Stanford, moved over to the ACC, leaving Oregon State and Washington State to be the only teams left in what used to be a power conference. The SEC even saw a major shift in additions of Texas and Oklahoma from the Big 12, and geographically, most of these movements don't make any sense and have severely affected the distribution of good teams per conference, putting almost all of the country's biggest programs between the SEC and the Big 10. Sure, we got some good regular season games out of this, but the decision was overall not necessary, as they likely would have clashed in the playoffs at some point anyways. With that being said, the 12-team playoff was another really unneeded addition to the season. Regardless of where you stand on how many teams should compete for a national championship, I think we can all agree that 12 is a little too much. I personally think that 6 to 8 is the sweet spot, but once you go beyond 8, you start to increase the chance of early blowouts, which was already an issue during the 4-team playoff. This one is just my opinion, but adding so many playoff games kind of hurts the stakes of the regular season. In a normal year, Alabama losing 2 games would have for sure put the Tide completely out of the title picture. In 2024, Alabama lost 3 regular season games and were still in the conversation on Selection Day. As much of an Alabama fan as I am, that should not be happening under any circumstances. The only thing making that day worse was seeing the amount of high tides I saw on Twitter. Don't even get me started on the commercials. Not that the commercials themselves are bad, but because they just never shut up. This has been an issue in college football forever, but it felt like this was the worst it's been in a while. In just one game alone, you can expect to see Dr. Pepper's Fansville, Mayhem telling you to get Allstate, Chick-fil-A testimonies, Nissan cars, Coke Zero Sugar, and you will expect each of these ads during every single commercial break at least 20 times. It is so annoying. If you're like me and want to watch every game that's on TV, you can expect to see these commercials over 100 times on any given Saturday. This, just like the other mentioned bads, all really boil down to money at the end of the day, so ultimately, there's nothing we can really do about it. So those were the minor gripes I had with college football in 2024, but now we're getting into the deep territory. Kicking off our ugly section is none other than Florida State. As mentioned earlier, Florida State exited the 2023 season with one thing on its mind: vengeance. After failing to make the CFP despite having an undefeated record, Florida State protested bowl season by having almost every single starter opt out of the Orange Bowl game against Georgia, and this showed in the final score. The Seminoles were projected to be one of the best teams heading into the 2024 season. After barely missing the 4-team playoff, there was no way that Mike Norvell's squad was going to plunder in the 12-team format. Right?
44 yards away to do it. He got it! He got it! And Farmer 6'3", 318. Show up the middle with a flag down. He's in the end zone for a touchdown. Florida State had 12 on the field, and it still didn't matter. Play action. And again, end zone touchdown. Pressure coming. Intercepted. Kobe Wilson to pick. Trying to take it across midfield. Does. And still on his feet. Out of 2 tackles. And Wilson.
Florida State went from having a perfect regular season to nearly losing every single game, with their only 2 wins being against California and Charleston Southern. This was easily one of the worst turnarounds of any team in the history of college football. I don't think there is anything that's a bigger testament to Florida State's downfall this season, quite like the dog poop curse, where an FSU fan on Twitter vowed to consume dog excrement if Boston College beat the Noles in Week 2. Of course, the Noles started 0-2, leading to the owner of the Twitter account deleting his profile. This sent Florida State fans into a frenzy because they started losing games left and right, leading the fan base to put the blame on a curse started by the guy on Twitter. Week in and week out, the city of Tallahassee was essentially begging this random guy to eat dog poop so their college football team could start winning again. The cherry on top of all of this is that a different fan finally stepped up and ate it on the original guy's behalf, and the Noles kept losing. Florida State's 2024 will forever be on the university's wall of shame. Up next, we have to talk once more about the 12-team playoff. I mentioned earlier that I didn't necessarily like how big the playoff was, but while you're allowed to disagree with me on that point, I think we can all agree on one thing, and that is that the auto bid system has got to go. The auto bid system was an abysmal addition to the college football playoffs. Basically, there are 5 teams that get a guaranteed playoff spot, those teams being the 5 highest ranked conference champions. One of the biggest problems that come from this is a seeding chart that makes absolutely no sense and does not reflect the final CFP rankings at all. One might claim that this is done to stop the conference championships from becoming irrelevant, but that can simply be done by making the playoffs smaller. You know it's bad when the people in charge of announcing the selections are publicly bashing how stupid the format is during the selection show. All in all, I'm not against the idea of an expanded playoff format, but how they went about it was downright awful. There are a lot of takeaways from the 2024 college football season, but man, there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that comes even close to being as bad as the officiating. Last but not least, the ugliest thing from this past season was definitely the really horrible officiating. Officiating is one of those things that will always be inconsistent in any given year, but man, was it atrocious in 2024. There were some calls this season that rival that ball don't lie clip from the 2013 Outback Bowl. Allow me to just list off some of the most ridiculous calls from the year. South Carolina missed the playoffs because of 2 defensive touchdowns that were called back in their game against LSU. Virginia Tech had a Hail Mary touchdown that was called as such on the field, but then overturned despite no clear evidence. Kentucky had a pick 6 overturned against Georgia that would have definitely shaken up the playoff picture had it stood, and the Wildcats won. Nebraska had the ball get incorrectly spotted against their favor, leading to a clock runoff that forced them to kick a field goal instead of a potential touchdown against Ohio State. Alabama had Ryan Williams get called back against Oklahoma for illegal touching, despite that straight up not even happening. And the biggest failure, of course, being the Bottlegate debacle between Texas and Georgia. It's one thing to make a bad call in college football, but to straight up invent rules on the spot and overturn a pass interference call, which mind you has never happened ever before, is straight up ridiculous. I think what made this all the more worse was the only reason they did it was because Texas's student section started throwing trash on the field, setting this precedent that it's totally okay to try and harm officials to make them change calls. We saw this trend continue in multiple other games later in the season, where fans were simply just crying to get a call changed by littering the field with debris. Of course, the refs now have to double down on their decisions to stop the incentive of trash throwing. If this season gets remembered for anything, it will likely be the terrible officiating that gets remembered the most. To shed some positivity back on this video, I do want to say that I had an amazing time watching so many games this year. There were some blunders for sure, but overall it was one of the most hyped up college football seasons ever, and it delivered on many fronts. I can safely say that being patted down by the Secret Service before watching a 17-year-old torch one of the best defenses in the country was a top 5 day in my entire life. Even if my favorite team didn't meet expectations, that doesn't mean that I didn't have fun, and I will always hold those memories close to my heart. I've always said that the best part about sports is the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, and sometimes you just have to sit and watch the latter. I have faith that the expanded playoff will eventually become better as time goes on. It was obvious that year 1 was more experimental than anything else, so I'm excited to see how the system grows and how the selection improves going forward. Thank you guys for watching another episode of the Pigskin Parrot. I just want to end this video by thanking you guys for officially getting me to 100 subscribers. It's been a little bit of a road, but we finally made it to that first milestone in my YouTube career. I just want to thank you guys for making my UFL video my most successful video yet, totaling at over 4,000 views and still counting to this day. With that being said, I've gone ahead and kind of included a link to that video in the description since the UFL kicks off next week, and I want you guys to kind of get a feel for the league. If you haven't watched that video yet and you want to kind of see my case for why you should be a fan of the UFL, go ahead and click that video. Once again, I put it in the description for you guys, and I can't wait for you guys to watch it. Also, I'm really excited for the next college football season. As you can see, I got my room decked out in the old Alabama stuff, hoping that the Tide can maybe take things to the promised land this year. No guarantees, but it's always possible. And speaking of that, I will be filming a video from A-Day in Tuscaloosa, Alabama on April 12th, so be on the lookout for that too. Thank you for all of your support, and thank you again for watching. My name is Preston McElhaney, and this has been another episode of the Pigskin Parrot. Thank you for watching.
And that is starting to do that next year. You're a wonderful lady. I got Alabama in the Kalen DeBoer era putting a stamp on the SEC.